So, we're almost halfway through 2020 already. Jesus Christ, this year's fucking flown by. This year's been a mad one, obviously, with all the social unrest, the pandemic, the Australian bushfires, World War III nearly starting. But on a brighter note, it has been a pretty amazing year for music so far. There's been at least 20 or 30 fire albums that I've heard, at least. I'm going to be listing 10 albums, not 10 through 1, so these aren't a ranking such. It's just the 10 albums that I feel are the strongest to come out of the year so far. And at the end, I'll throw in a few honourable mentions as well. So the first album that we're going to talk about is Circles by Mac Miller, which dropped very early in the year, actually. I think it was mid or late January. Of course, this was Mac's first and I assume only posthumous release after his unfortunate passing in 2018. This was, for me, one of the most intimate musical experiences that I've had this year. And this is for someone who's not even a devoted Mac fan. I've obviously retroactively gone back and listened to most of his catalogue just to gain a wider context for Circles. But I feel this was so personal. And even without the context of his passing, it still would have been a moving album. But obviously you have to take that into account. And what I found is that I feel it's an album that provides quite a lot of closure for not just those who are personal friends and family of Mac's, but also his diehard fans. And that closure is that his final words on record are ones of hope and of optimism. It's an incredibly musically literate album as well. Obviously, thanks in part to John Bryan coming on board and finishing up the album for Mac. It's mainly a singer-songwriter album. There's a couple full-on rap tracks, of course, like Blue World. But this is one of the most fully realised and cohesive albums that I think I've heard all year. I think it's very hard to get a posthumous album right, as we've seen with artists like X, for example. But I think this is the best possible version of Circles that we could have even imagined. Next album, How I'm Feeling Now by Charli XCX. Of course, again, we have to take into account the circumstances under which this album was recorded. The entire concept is that it was completely produced and written during this current pandemic over the period, I think, of about 5 or 6 weeks. It was a very, very collaborative process. Charli was constantly updating her fans and collaborators on Twitter and Zoom and just all forms of social media. I think this album is it's a very erratic album, but I say erratic in a good way. It's eclectic, but it's very, very different and distinct from her previous releases, especially the fact that she usually brings on board a shitload of vocal contributors, but this album is pretty much just her as far as I can remember. It's it's actually quite a personal album. It was more personal than I was expecting, considering some of the singles that dropped. A lot of the album for me is concerned with Charli coming face to face with her insecurities and worries and flaws, and they all come to a head by the climax of the album, especially on a song like Party For You, which I felt was the emotional centerpiece of the entire project. Strangely enough, this album has some of the most somber things she's ever made, again, like Party For You, but also some of the most batshit insane stuff she's ever made, like Pink Diamond and like Anthems. For how forward-thinking and willing to experiment Charli is, it's no surprise that she was the first person to record an album during a fucking global pandemic, and it turned out even better than I was expecting. Another album which is of its time, so to speak, is Run the Jewels with RTJ4. I think this is, without a doubt, the most relevant and politically charged album, regardless of genre, of 2020 so far. It sounds like an album for the end of days, for the apocalypse, which is fitting when you combine the current health pandemic that's going on and the social unrest. Killer Mike and LP deliver some of their most brutal, to the point, biting social commentary that they've done on any album, and this is all done without ever preaching to their audience without dictating what they should feel. And I think that's a very, very fine line to toe, especially for rappers who are talking about issues that are this weighty and relevant. It's not a concept album. It doesn't really have like a linear narrative, but I think there is a narrative to this album. And for me, it sounds like a kind of descent into madness spurred on by all the bullshit that's going on right now. This album's very, very cinematic. It's grand in its scope as well, which is surprising and impressive, the fact that it's this grand and it clocks in at under 40 minutes. Now, for one of the more underrated albums of 2020, in my personal opinion, I don't care what anyone says, but I think Eternal Atake is Uzi's best work by far. I think it's infinitely superior to that bullshit that we got the week after Eternal Atake, the Uzi versus the World 2 or Eternal Atake Deluxe or whatever the fuck you want to call it. That was a load of trash, in my opinion. It was so clear to me that these were two albums that were made in completely different headspaces and two different time periods as well. The beats are very, very animated and full of life, surprisingly textured, and they're very unique as well, especially a beat like You Better Move, which samples the fucking old Windows PC pinball game. I think Uzi on this album is the most entertaining he's been in his career so far. His bars are consistently witty, his flows are dynamic and varied and versatile. He's very creative, he's got the punchlines, he's got the flows, and he's got the confidence and swagger as well. I will admit that the album kind of slugs for a few songs in the middle section, but I can overlook that simply because this album is just so damn endlessly entertaining. There's certain songs that I've been rinsing so much. Songs like Baby Pluto, Prices, Urgency. There's at least 11, 12 or 13, about 11 or 12 songs on this album which I think are fire. Speaking of fire, Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist dropped a surprise album on us in late May with Alfredo. I know I said I wasn't ranking these albums, but I can't lie. Alfredo is my favourite album of 2020 so far, bar none. Gibbs, again, it's never been in doubt. It's never been in doubt for the past 9-10 years. He's one of the best rappers working today. There's no doubt about it. But I think what's unique about this album is that although it's a collaborative album, it's Gibbs and the Alchemist. I think the Alchemist tailor-made specific beats for Gibbs that allowed him to reign free and be the most expressive and vulnerable that he's ever been on record. Of course, it's full of grim, brutal, honest portrayals about the gangster lifestyle, but most importantly, that portrayal is never glamorized. Of course, there's some fire features: Rick Ross, Benny the Butcher, Conway the Machine, Tyler the Creator. I've spoken about this album on this channel before, so there'll be a banner somewhere. Go check that review out. Now, very, very different album to Alfredo is Dua Lipa's second album, Future Nostalgia. I think that's a perfectly fitting title for an album that is very explicitly retro in its sound and aesthetic, but it's never derivative. It's a tight, concise, very, very fun collection of disco and funk infused pop songs. It's kind of a breezy, effortless swagger to Dua Lipa's performance on this album, and I think that's what makes this have so much replay value for me, at least. I think for one of the biggest pop stars in this country, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how popular she is over in America, but at least here in England, for one of the biggest pop stars working right now to deliver an album that is pretty much devoid of fillers and so cohesive and consistent, and there's a clear concept to it, I think that's a rare thing to find. I don't care who the fuck you are, there are certain bangers on this album that if you're not dancing to them, you're just lying. You're just lying. You're just scared to say that you fuck with Dua Lipa. If you're not dancing to fucking Break My Heart or Physical, fuck you. Yeah, no, Future Nostalgia is a very, very clear progression from the self-titled album, which was, 2 or 3 years ago, I think. She's clearly taken that time to sit down, find a clear lane for this album and a clear concept, and delivered it effortlessly. Again, a very different album from the last album. Storm Damage by Ben Watt. I think this album is an incredibly personal, albeit down tempo, but very, very personal and intimate collection of songs. To me, this album sounds like a study of the process of aging and all that comes along with that. It deals with loss, change, regret, and reflecting on your own mortality. I think songs like Irene, Balance on a Wire, and Summer Ghosts are literally some of the most beautiful pieces of music I've heard all year. Instrumentally, everything is so crisp and grand and vivid and rich, especially those drums and those double basses all over the album. The very, very overtly descriptive method of songwriting makes it very, very easy to sympathize with him on this album. I do think that it's an album that should be talked about more, especially this year, but it's a very moody and down-tempo album, so I can see why it might not be for everyone, but if you're in the right mood, definitely check this album out. Now, another album that, again, I feel is somewhat underappreciated is Everything is Beautiful by Princess Nokia. This is just one of the most pure expressions of emotion that I've heard on record all year. Of course, this was released alongside another album, Everything Sucks, but I think in comparison to that album, this album is very clearly... It was very clearly worked on for a long period of time, at least from what I can hear. I think there's more of a structure to these songs, and the songwriting for me is far superior. The things that are driving this album are honesty, vulnerability, and acceptance. And of course, there's a very, very strong emphasis on live, organic instrumentation all over the album. But make no mistake, Princess Nokia spits. She can spit. She spits on this album, especially on songs like Gemini and Wavy. I have seen some criticisms that a lot of this album sounds as if Princess Nokia is being different just for different sake. I can kind of understand that critique because she lays it on pretty hard, but I can overlook that by the fact that she's just being so honest on most of the tracks on here. Her willingness to be open to her emotions and her flaws more than makes up for that small critique that I might have. And I must address the last song, The Conclusion, which is one of the most stunning closers to an album I've heard all year. Next up, we have newest King Krule album, Man Alive. This new album continues King Krule's tradition for versatility, smashing together elements of jazz, post-punk, hip-hop. He takes on the role of essentially a kind of street poet, musing on the relatively mundane situations in his life. Not too dissimilar from someone like Mike Skinner of the Streets. I do understand that it can be quite a claustrophobic and overwhelming listen at times, but the expressiveness in his voice and his lyrics make up for that. I always have to remind myself of how young King Krule is when I'm listening to him. That's because this is the work of an extremely talented musician who's also very clearly mature ahead of his years. And even though I recognize that maturity, I also recognize that a lot of these songs are intrinsically linked to the idea of youth. And it's for that reason why I kind of see this album as a transition kind of album or period for him. He recognizes his own maturity and he recognizes that he's growing up while still holding on to the last embers of his youth. Last album on this list, and don't care what you say, I think this is maybe the most underrated album of 2020 so far, and that's 3:15:20 by Childish Gambino. I'm going to go on record and say that I think this is his best album to date. Come at me. It's Gambino at his most expressive, experimental, and free. I think the second song, Algorithm, is, in my mind, maybe the best written song of his career. And alongside those fucking pounding, tribal, booming, massive drums that are going on in the background, this song sounds like a song for the times. When I say a song for the times, I don't mean something as explicitly political and revolutionary as RTJ4, what I imagine when I hear this song is kind of the natural world and the artificial world interweaving to create something new, which is kind of a reflection of the society that we live in now. Of course, risk-taking and experimenting with music doesn't always pay off for every artist at every turn. And I do understand some issues and critiques some people have with this album, that it's obtuse, it's meandering, it can be long-winded, at times it could be self-indulgent. I recognise those critiques, but I can overlook those small flaws for me personally, just because of how ambitious and grand and rich this album is. Also, I must mention the 4-song streak of Algorithm, Time, 1238 and 1910 is one of, if not the strongest streak on a single album this year. It's a very manic album. Gambino takes on a multitude of different perspectives and portrays a number of characters, but he doesn't just portray them on a very surface and basic level. He takes a lot of care in portraying these characters, and I think that's something that you don't really see too much of. Also, 3222 is maybe the most batshit insane thing I've heard in 2020 so far. The first time I heard it, I was like, what the fuck is this? But I can't deny that it's fire. And of course, Feels Like Summer, which dropped a couple years ago, also makes an appearance on this album under a different name. Again, I still, to this day, think that is, again, one of Childish Gambino's best written songs. Yeah, no, don't sleep on 3:15:20. It's fire. It's fire. Yeah, that's it. That's my 10 in no particular order. Again, not ranking these. There were so many albums that were floating around my mind for this list. There was loads that I had to leave off, unfortunately, just because I don't want to be sitting here all fucking day. Albums like Unlocked, Denzel Curry and Kenny Beats, fire mini album. Pray for Paris, West Side Gun, my introduction to West Side Gun, very solid. Written Testimony, J Electronica, waited 14 years for it. I don't think it disappointed. Misanthropocene by Grimes, very, very dark, ethereal, brooding, textured album, but very, very solid. Tame Impala, The Slow Rush, albeit not as good as Currents, I still think it's a very, very detailed, funky, ethereal, psychedelic album that Kevin Parker is known for. After Hours, The Weeknd, I think I like the album, but I think it's a bit overrated. It's still very, very strong. I think the title track is amazing. A slew of standout singles on there, but I think it's ever so slightly overrated, but it's still a very good album. Heaven or Hell, Don Toliver, very strong debut album. Grey by Moses Sumney, his first album in 3 years, massive album, over an hour long. And Thundercats, It Is What It Is, funky as shit. So funky. That's my 10. That's my 10 for the year so far. Interested to see which of these will make it onto my list at the end of the year. Make sure to like, subscribe, and dong the bell. And I will see you next time.